They thought she was just a waitress, someone they could mock, intimidate, even buy for the night. The bikers laughed, throwing money on the counter, daring anyone to stop them. But Hannah stayed calm, her silence unbroken, until one quiet phone call brought the man they never expected. Her father wasn't just a widower. He was Delta Force. By the time the sheriff's lights cut through the windows, the gang lay scattered, their leader pinned under his boot. What happens when arrogance collides with trained silence and a father's love? This is the night Fern's Diner will never forget. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sound came long before the sight. A low rumble at first, like distant thunder rolling over the flat Ohio fields, but then sharper, louder, closer. Glasses rattled against the shelves and forks clinked against plates as the vibration worked its way through the old timber frame of Fern's Crossroads Diner. The handful of regulars, farmers in faded caps, a trucker halfway through his coffee, and two high school kids splitting a plate of fries, lifted their heads as the roar grew into something undeniable. 40 motorcycles, heavy and hungry, roared in unison as they turned off County Road 15 and slid into the gravel lot. Engines cut one by one, a staggered chorus of power snapping into silence. Chrome glinted under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the diner sign, which sputtered the word Fern's in half-dead neon. Boots hit gravel, loud enough to be heard through the glass panes, followed by the jangle of chains, the scrape of kickstands, and the low hum of voices that carried more warning than welcome. The steel vultures weren't from this town, but their reputation stretched farther than the state line. Inside, the air shifted. Sam, the cook, froze mid-motion with the spatula, grease sizzling on the flat top behind him. His eyes flicked toward the waitress moving along the counter, her hair tied back, her face calm. Hannah Cross didn't look up as the shadows passed the windows. She wiped down mugs with steady movements, though the rag twisted a little tighter in her hand. The men at the counter adjusted in their seats, trying not to look nervous, trying not to be caught staring when the first of the gang pushed open the door. The bell above it jingled like it always did, a sound too light and ordinary for what came with it. Leather vests stamped with patches, faces lined from hard living, laughter that had no warmth in it. They filled the doorway. Then the booze, their presence swallowing the diner in seconds. Boots scuffed the old linoleum, and the smell of gasoline and cigarettes mingled with fried onions and burnt coffee. A quiet place that had lived on routine was now pulled into the orbit of men who thrived on disruption. The regulars sank back into their seats. A farmer lifted his mug to his lips, though it was already empty, just to have something to do with his hands. The trucker folded his newspaper, but didn't dare leave. The high school kids slid out of their booth and slipped through the back exit, their laughter gone, replaced by the quick shuffle of shoes. Hannah moved between tables without rush or panic. Her eyes stayed down, her hands steady as she set menus on the counter the gang had claimed. A leader of sorts, broad-shouldered with a scar curling down his jaw, leaned forward and watched her every move. His smirk spread as if he'd already decided the diner, and everyone inside it belonged to him for the night. The sound of the engine still lingered in the air, a ghostly vibration in the floorboards, but it was a silence now that carried weight. Conversations had died. Coffee cups sat untouched. The gang had arrived, and with them came the unspoken understanding that the night at Fern's Crossroads Diner would not follow its usual script. It would bend, shift, or break under weight of men who had just swallowed it whole. Hannah moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who had worked the counter long enough to know every chip in the porcelain, every scratch in the laminate, every creak of the stools when someone shifted their weight. The rag in her hand moved across the surface of a mug that didn't need cleaning, but gave her something to do while the presence of the bikers filled the space around her like smoke. She kept her eyes lowered, her face calm, her posture careful, measuring a way that told anyone watching that she knew how to survive long shifts and longer stares. Her hair, tied back in a loose knot, slipped strands across her cheek, and she tucked them away without pausing her work. Behind her, the coffee pot hissed low and steady, the sound familiar, grounding. She poured into cups as though nothing had changed, as though the men who had taken over half the diner weren't spreading out with heavy boots on the seats and elbows on the counters, their laughter echoing off the chrome and tile. to the regulars, Hannah was more than the girl at the counter. She was a daughter of Daniel Cross, though few ever spoke of him openly. Most knew only that it served somewhere somehow, and that when his wife passed, he raised Hannah on his own. She had grown up quiet, steady, working shifts through high school and afterward to help keep the bills paid. Her strength wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind that threw weight around. It was the kind you saw in her patience, in the way she endured long hours on her feet without complaint, in the way she could meet a cruel look without flinching and still hand over a refill cup. Now, though, the stares were not the ordinary kind she had learned to ignore. These eyes lingered, searching, weighing her in a way that made the regulars shift in their seats, ashamed of their silence. A scar-faced man leaned against the counter, his hand resting too close to where hers worked. He smiled without humor, tapping a finger on the wood, trying to draw her attention. Hannah didn't look up. She slid the refilled mug toward him and moved on to the next, as though he were no different than any other customer. It wasn't defiance. It was survival. She had learned that sometimes the safest response was no response at all, that silence could be stronger than words when spoken into the wrong ears. She knew that her calm could be mistaken for weakness, but she also knew the danger of feeding a challenge into a room full of men who thrived on it. So she stayed small, steady, her eyes on the coffee, on the rag, on the safe routines that carried her through nights like this before. Sam, the cook, glanced out from the kitchen window, his brow creased. He had worked beside Hannah long enough to see the tension in the severed shoulders, even when her movements stayed smooth. He wanted to step out, to say something, but he knew the balance was fragile. The wrong word could tip the room. So he went back to his grill, spatula clattering against steel, pretending to be busier than he was. Hannah kept moving, mug after mug, plate after plate, while the laughter swelled and the boots scraped. The neon outside flickered against the glass, casting shadows across her face, shadows that made her look even younger, though her eyes, when she dared to lift them, carried the weight of someone who had already lived through more than most would guess. She was not loud. She was not bold. But there was something in her stillness, something in the way she endured, that hinted at a strength no one in the room yet recognized. The diner had settled into that strange kind of silence that comes when noise is present but no one really hears it. The bikers laughed too loud, their words spilling into the air like oil across water, but the regulars no longer dared respond. They stirred their coffee, stared at their plates, and prayed for the night to pass without incident. Hannah kept her pace steady, her rags sweeping over the counter in slow arcs, her eyes on the surface beneath her hands. It was the only way to keep from meeting the gaze of the man who had been watching her since the moment he walked in. He leaned back on the stool now, leather creaking under his weight, his scar pulling tight as he smirked. The silver rings on his fingers tapped against the counter, like a drummer finding a rhythm. Then, without warning, he reached into his vest, pulled out a folded wad of bills, and let it fall onto the counter with a slap that made cups rattle. The bills spread across the wood, green against the pale laminate, and the sound cut through every other noise in the diner. The laughter from his brothers slowed, then quieted, until only the hiss of the coffee pot and the sizzle from Sam's grill filled the silence. "Looks about right for the night," he said, his voice carrying more arrogance than volume. The others chuckled, the sound low and mean, as if they'd been waiting for one of them to finally say what was sitting in all their grins. He nodded at Hannah, his eyes sliding over her with the slow confidence of a man who thought money was enough to bend anyone. "That buys your time, sweetheart. Don't pretend you're too good for it." The words hung in the air, heavy and rotten. The farmers at the end of the counter stiffened, but none of them spoke. The trucker's spoon clinked against his mug as he set it down too hard. Then he pushed the cup away, his jaw working. Everyone had their eyes on Hannah now, waiting, dreading. Her hand froze for only a second, rag pressed against the rim of a mug she had already polished clean. She didn't look at the money. She didn't look at the man. She set the mug down, slid it into place among the others, and reached for the next as if nothing had happened. The refusal was in her silence, in her refusal to acknowledge the offer, in her decision to keep working like the cash was invisible. The biker's smirk widened, his teeth flashing. He pushed the bills closer to her, the edge of the wad nudging against her wrist. "Maybe you didn't hear me," he drawled. That's cash money. More than you'll see in tips for the next month. His brothers laughed again, louder now, feeding off the tension like wolves circling. Hannah's rag slipped from her hand, but she didn't reach for the money. She stepped back just enough to make it clear she wouldn't touch it, her shoulders drawn straight, though her eyes stayed low. For the first time, her silence wasn't mistaken as weakness. It was defiance, though subtle, though quiet. Sam shifted in the kitchen doorway, spatula clutched like a weapon he had no business wielding. He opened his mouth, then closed it again when the scar-faced biker turned his head just enough to catch him watching. The message was clear. Stay out of it. The leader leaned forward, his voice dropping low, dangerous in its mockery. You're in the wrong kind of place to act like you're better than what's offered. Everyone's got a price. Don't make me raise it. The laughter swelled again, rough and jagged, filling the diner like smoke. Hannah didn't flinch, though her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron, brushing against the worn fabric where her phone rested. She didn't pull it out. Not yet. She kept her breathing even, her eyes on the counter, and her silence intact, as though she knew something the rest of the room didn't. The cash sat between them like a dare, green and heavy, while the night bent under the weight of a choice no one had asked her to make. Would you like me to continue directly into Chapter 4, where the gang erupts in louder laughter and the regulars shrink even smaller into their seats? The first burst of laughter came like a crack of thunder, loud and sharp, bouncing off the walls of the diner until it seemed to rattle in every corner. The scar-faced biker slapped the counter with his palm, sending the bills fluttering slightly, and his brothers followed with howls that grew into a chorus. Some bent forward, shoulders shaking. Others leaned back on their stools, boots propped against the counter edge, their grins wide and unkind. The sound filled the space, drowning out the steady hiss of the coffee pot and the faint squeak of Sam's spatula against the grill. It wasn't ordinary laughter. It was layered with something darker. A sound meant less for amusement and more for dominance, a display as sharp as a raised fist. It told the room who was in charge, who could say what they wanted, who could toss money like bait and turn a quiet waitress into the punchline of a cruel joke. The regulars shrank under the noise. The farmers at the far end of the counter hunched their shoulders and looked down into their mugs as though they might find shelter there. One adjusted the builder's cap, tugging it lower to shade his eyes. The trucker in the corner picked up his newspaper again, though the pages trembled in his hands as he pretended to read words his eyes refused to follow. Even the high school kids who had ducked back in after slipping out earlier froze at the door, then turned on their heels, disappearing once more into the night. The laughter rolled on, and in it was a kind of invitation, daring anyone to speak up, to break the rhythm. No one did. Silence belonged to the regulars now, a silence heavy with fear and shame, as though the very air punished them for breathing. The only one who didn't shrink was Hannah. She moved along the counter, rag in hand, her steps measured, her eyes lowered, her stillness cut against the wild noise, though it wasn't defiance in any loud sense. It was something quieter, something that went unnoticed by the gang too caught in their own echo. One of the bikers elbowed the man beside him, pointing toward Sam in the kitchen window. Sam's eyes darted down, his hands fumbling with the spatula before he disappeared back into the smoke and grease, retreating where he couldn't be seen. Another roar of laughter followed him, the kind of laughter that made a man's retreat feel like surrender. The scar-faced leader leaned back on a stool, his boots scraping across the floor, and lifted his chin as if the entire diner were his stage. He looked around at the bowed heads and quiet stares, his smirk growing with every second of cowardice he saw. He knew the sound of victory when he heard it, and tonight it wasn't the clatter of chains or the hum of engines. It was laughter, and the way it silenced a room full of people too afraid to answer it. Hannah poured coffee into a cup, the dark liquid steaming, her hand steady despite the swell of noise pressing in from every side. She set the cup down gently, her movements so ordinary they almost felt defiant. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't flinch when another burst of laughter shook the room. Instead, she carried on as if this were any other night, as if she hadn't just been turned into the object of a cruel game. The cash still sat on the counter, a pile of green that none of the bikers touched again, because it wasn't about money anymore. It was about power, about how easily they could bend a town with nothing more than a joke and a roar. And as their laughter rose and fell, rattling the windows and filling every corner. The diner itself seemed to shrink, pressed smaller and smaller under the weight of noise that refused to end. The sound of their laughter lingered in the walls long after it began to fade. It was still there in the air, a kind of vibration that clung to the booths and the counter, even when the bikers' voices dropped into mutters and low jokes only they found amusing. Hannah moved through the space like she always did, her steps measured, her hands steady. She reached for a plate left abandoned at the far end of the counter, slid it gently into her arm, and carried it to the bus bin without ever letting her eyes rise above the level of the dishes. Her silence drew its own kind of attention to the bikers. It read like surrender, as though their laughter pushed her down into herself and left her too timid to resist. They watched her as she moved from one end of the diner to the other, her rag tucked in her apron, her hands quick and quiet. She didn't speak, didn't meet their eyes, didn't even acknowledge the cash still lying across the counter where the scar-faced man had tossed it. To them, that was confirmation. She was weak. She was afraid. And fear, to men like these, meant possession. But the regulars knew better. They had seen Hannah work long hours through nights when tempers flared, when drunks came in loud and angry, when words turned sharp. They knew she had a way of lowering her eyes that wasn't weakness at all. It was calculation. She knew how to wait storms out, how to make herself invisible until danger passed. Still, even they couldn't deny that tonight was different. Tonight, the storm wasn't blowing over. Tonight, the storm had settled in, boots planted on the diner floor, and it wasn't leaving quietly. Hannah stacked 2 more plates into the crook of her arm, their forks clinking lightly against the porcelain. She moved past the scar-faced leader without slowing, his smirk widening as he leaned back to give her room. His eyes trailed after her, lingering far too long, and when she passed, he spoke low enough for the others to hear, but loud enough that she couldn't miss it. Look at her. Won't even look up. Knows where she belongs. The laughter that followed wasn't as loud as before, but it carried the same edge, sharp and mean. Her eyes dropped further, not in shame, but in control. She placed the plates into the bus bin, wiped her hands on her apron, and reached for the next table. A pair of farmers in the corner shifted uncomfortably, their hands hovering near their cups as if they wanted to speak, but couldn't force the words past their throats. One gave a small shake of his head, the kind that said he wished he had the courage but knew he didn't. The bikers mistook the silence of the room for dominance, mistook Hannah's stillness for fragility. Every time she lowered her gaze, they read it as submission. Every time she turned away, they thought she was breaking. What they couldn't see, what none of them knew, was that Hannah's silence was not a crack in her resolve, but a shield. She was listening. She was watching in her own way, noting their movements, their tones, the shape of their cruelty. She carried another stack of dishes back to the counter, her posture never faltering. The rag slipped from her apron pocket, and she bent to pick it up, her face hidden from them for a moment. When she straightened, her expression was blank calm, as though she had pulled her real self deep inside and locked it away where their laughter couldn't touch it. To the gang, she was just a waitress too scared to meet their gaze. To the men hunched at the counter, she was a daughter trying to endure long enough for something, anything, to break the night's hold. To herself, she was a shadow in her own space, waiting, biding, holding on to silence because she knew it was stronger than giving them a single word. The small house at the edge of town sat in stillness, its porch light glowing faintly against the creeping dusk. Inside, Daniel Cross moved with the precision of a man who never let his body forget the discipline of years gone by. The air in the front room smelled faintly of sweat and steel. A pull-up bar hung in the doorway, a set of free weights stacked neatly against the wall, and a heavy bag swung gently from the last push of his fists. He finished his routine without ceremony, lowering himself in the bar with steady control, his breath even, his body lean but strong. To anyone looking in from the outside, he was simply a man staying fit, a widower in his 50s who lived alone and kept himself. He wiped his brow with the towel slung over his shoulder, moving to the kitchen where a tea kettle whistled softly. The routine was always the same: workout, shower, tea, and a book before bed. The neighbors knew him as quiet, polite, maybe even a little solitary. He waved from the porch when people passed. helped shovel driveways in the winter, and once patched a kid's bike chain without being asked. He was dependable, steady. What they didn't know, what no one in Anvil Creek really knew, was what lay behind the quiet. Daniel Cross had spent most of his life in places where silence meant survival and control meant life or death. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a small wooden box, plain and unassuming. Inside were medals, ribbons, and insignias, none of which he displayed. They were reminders of a life lived in shadows, missions carried out where recognition never followed. Delta Force wasn't something you announced. It was something etched into your bones, something you carried in the way you scanned every room without thinking, in the way you heard a car engine on the street and identified its make by sound alone. Daniel didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. He poured hot water over a tea bag, steam curling upward into the low light. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. To the world, he was simply winding down after a day of carpentry work. He fixed furniture now, crafted cabinets, built tables. Things that lasted, things solid and dependable, unlike the fragility of flesh and the impermanence of war. The townsfolk admired his craftsmanship, never questioning how his hands, capable of violence, could shape wood with such quiet care. He set his tea on the table and lowered himself into the chair by the window, stretching his legs out as he opened the book that lay waiting. His eyes traced a page, though a part of him never fully relaxed. Old instincts lived just under the surface. The way his head turned slightly at the sound of a car a block away, the way his back never fully pressed into the chair, always angled, always ready. To the people of Anvil Creek, Daniel was a quiet man who lived alone and raised a daughter on his own after his wife passed. They saw him at the diner sometimes, sitting in the corner, sharing breakfast with Hannah before her shift started. They saw him at church, bowing his head in silence. They didn't see the man who had once slipped through desert nights with a rifle across his chest, or the man who had led brothers through jungles without leaving a trace. That man was gone, or at least he pretended he was. As he turned a page, his phone buzzed on the table. The sound was soft, ordinary, but it froze him mid-breath. He didn't need words. He didn't need an explanation. One glance at the screen, one silent call, told him everything he needed to know. The routine ended there. The man the neighbors thought they knew dissolved in an instant, and the other man, the one trained to answer calls that came without words, was already rising from the chair. The hiss of the grill filled the narrow kitchen, a steady background rhythm that usually meant comfort at Fern's Crossroads diner. Tonight it sounded sharper, more insistent, the noise of meat searing and grease popping carrying a nervous edge. Sam stood at the flat top, spatula in hand, though he hadn't flipped a burger in minutes. He kept glancing through the small service window into the dining room, where the bikers had spread themselves across booths and stools like they owned the place. Their laughter bled back into the kitchen, heavy and mocking, seeping into every corner until a familiar space felt foreign. Hannah passed behind him with a tray of plates, her shoulders straight, her eyes lowered the same way they had been all night. She moved like a shadow slipping through light, silent, steady, determined not to let them see her falter. Sam set down the spatula, wiped his hands on a towel, and leaned closer to her when she came near the pass-through. His voice dropped low, meant for her alone, the kind of whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Stay back here for a while," he said, his voice roughened by years of smoke and fry oil. "Let me handle the floor until they leave." Hannah shook her head almost immediately. "You can't," she whispered back. Her hand pressed the tray down onto the counter, steadying it before she carried it through the doorway. "If you go out there, it'll only get worse." Sam frowned, the deep lines of his face cutting deeper under the fluorescent light. He had been cooking in this diner for nearly 3 decades, had seen a share of late-night drunks and rowdy strangers. But this was different. The men out there weren't drunk farmhands or loudmouth salesmen. They carried themselves with the swagger of people used to taking what they wanted, and he knew from the way they looked at Hannah that she was the focus of their game tonight. He reached out, catching her wrist before she could slip back through the swinging door. "Hannah," he said, the name heavy on his tongue. "This ain't pride. This is danger. Let it pass. Stay put." She met his eyes for the first time that night. There was no fear in hers, only the calm steadiness she always carried when things got tense. She gently pulled her wrist free. "If I hide, they win," she said. Her voice was quiet, but the conviction in it settled like stone. "They're waiting for me to break. I won't give them that." Sam's jaw worked as though he wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He saw the same quiet strength he'd seen in her father's eyes on the few mornings Daniel stopped by for breakfast. It was a look that said retreat was not an option, not when someone else tried to claim the ground beneath your feet. Sam sighed, picked up the spatula again, and muttered under his breath, "Your old man wouldn't let this stand." Hannah didn't answer. She slipped back through the door, tray in hand, moving toward the counter where the bikers' voices rose again. Sam watched her go, his chest heavy with unease. He had tried to shield her with words, but words had no weight against men like those. As the door swung shut behind her, he turned back to the grill, spatula trembling slightly in his grip, and prayed that the night would hold together long enough for someone stronger to arrive. The low murmur of voices had turned into a restless hum. The bikers had eaten little of the food they ordered. Plates sat half-touched, fries going cold, burgers sagging under their own grease. They weren't here to eat. They were here to claim space, to stretch their shadows across the diner until everyone inside felt smaller. Hannah moved along the counter with her steady, quiet rhythm, clearing plates, refilling mugs, ignoring the pile of cash still sitting where it had been thrown earlier. The room seemed to lean toward her, all eyes waiting for the moment when the fragile balance would break. The scar-faced leader shifted on his stool, his boots scraping the floor. His smirk hadn't faded since the moment he put the money down. Every time Hannah passed, his gaze followed, heavier than words. Tonight wasn't about the food or the drink. It was about watching her flinch or proving she wouldn't. And when she didn't, when her silence stretched longer than his patience, his hand shot out. The move was sudden but not sloppy. His thick fingers wrapped around her wrist as she set down a mug, his grip tight, his rings pressing cold against her skin. The scrape of ceramic on laminate followed as the mug tipped sideways, coffee spilling in a dark streak across the counter. The sound of it breaking the silence was sharper than the laughter that came a second later, jagged and loud, filling every corner of the diner. "Still think you're too good for us," he said, his voice pitched low, meant to cut. He lifted her wrist slightly, not enough to drag her off balance, but enough to remind everyone watching that she was caught. The gang laughed with him, the cruel kind of laughter that made the regulars sink lower into their seats. Forks were abandoned mid-bite, mugs were pushed aside. No one moved to stand. No one spoke. Hannah didn't fight. She didn't pull away, didn't cry out. She let her arm go slack, her eyes lowering even further until the strands of hair that had slipped loose from her bun shielded her face. To the bikers, it looked like surrender, like she had finally given them what they wanted. Their laughter grew louder, harsher, feeding off the illusion of weakness. But to Sam, watching through the service window, it was something else entirely. He saw the steadiness in her shoulders, the way she shifted her weight just enough to stay balanced, the way her free hand stayed tucked against her apron pocket. She wasn't broken. She was waiting. And that realization tightened the knot in his gut, because waiting meant she expected someone or something to answer. The farmers at the counter exchanged glances, their shame thick in the air. One clenched his fist against his knees, but his courage died when another biker swung his gaze toward him, daring him to try. The trucker in the corner shifted uncomfortably, but stayed rooted to his seat. Silence was safer, even if it burned. The scar-faced man leaned closer to Hannah, his breath hot, his words sharp. "See, boys? Told you she just needed a little push. Everything's got a price." He squeezed her wrist once more, harder this time, testing her. The laughter around them rose, echoing off tile and chrome until it felt suffocating. And yet Hannah's eyes stayed low, her silence unbroken. The air in the diner thickened, every second stretching long, brittle, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The balance had tipped now, past the point of return. What had been mockery had turned to threat, and the night hung suspended on the edge of what would come next. The grip on her wrist was firm, the biker's rings biting into her skin, but Hannah's face betrayed nothing. She let her arm hang loose, her body shifting just slightly, to keep her balance, as though she were nothing more than a server waiting for a mug to be emptied. His laughter filled the space between them. His voice carried on the encouragement of his brothers, but Hannah's focus had already moved elsewhere. Her free hand, hidden beneath the edge of the counter, slid slowly toward her apron pocket, the way her phone rested there, cool against her fingertips, and she pressed her thumb over the screen with a precision that came not from panic, but from practice. The room hummed with noise, boots tapping, chairs scraping, voices rising. None of them noticed her subtle motion. Even Sam, peering to the past window, didn't realize until he saw the faintest glow against the apron's fabric. Hannah lowered her head further, letting her hair fall like a curtain, and tilted her body just enough that the scar-faced biker assumed she was submitting, folding into herself. He smirked, satisfied, never realizing she was slipping the core of their control even as he gripped her. Her thumb found a familiar number, the one she had never needed until now. She pressed once, twice, and the phone began its silent vibration. No words were needed. She didn't dare raise it to her ear. She didn't need to. One call was enough. On the other side of town, a phone buzzed on a small kitchen table, interrupting the quiet of a man whose instincts never dulled. Daniel Cross saw his daughter's name flash across the screen. He didn't ask why she hadn't spoken when he answered. He didn't ask why all he could hear was a faint hum of background noise, the muffled sounds of men laughing somewhere far away. He knew. He heard the strain of silence in her breathing, the kind of silence a soldier understands more than any spoken word. He didn't speak either. He simply ended the call, rose from his chair, and crossed the room with the efficiency of someone who had lived his entire life, ready to move at a moment's notice. In the corner, his boots sat by the door, polished out of habit, laces neatly coiled. He pulled them on without hurry, but every motion was precise, efficient. He reached for the jacket that hung by the entryway, the fabric warm but sturdy, and tucked his phone into the pocket. No hesitation touched his face. The quiet man his neighbors thought they knew was gone, and his place was the one they had never seen. Back at the diner, Hannah slipped the phone back into her apron, the movement as subtle as the first. She eased her wrist against the biker's grip, twisting just slightly, and with practiced patience, she let her arm slide free. It looked like nothing, a careless release on his part, another laugh at her expense. He didn't even notice she had taken something from him in that moment. The control he thought was absolute. She turned away, rag in hand once more, and wiped at the spilled coffee on the counter as if that were all that mattered. Around her, the laughter swelled again, but the balance had shifted in ways none of them could sense. She had made the call. She had lit the fuse. And somewhere across town, her father was already on his way. Daniel slid the phone back into his pocket, the silence of the disconnected call lingering heavier than words could ever weigh. His chair was still angled by the window, his tea still steaming faintly on the table, but the routine of the night was over. He stood with the ease of a man who had risen to urgency 1,000 times before. No rush, no wasted motion, but not a second of hesitation either. His hand reached for the keys on the hook by the door, the metallic jingle crisp in the stillness of the house. His face revealed nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even urgency. It was the same unreadable mask he had worn in deserts and jungles, in places where showing too much could get a man killed. But behind his eyes, something had shifted. The calm wasn't emptiness. It was a tightening of every wire inside him, a mind falling back into patterns carved by years of training. His daughter had called him without speaking. That silence told him more than 100 words could have. He had been summoned, and he knew exactly what that meant. He shrugged into his jacket, the fabric settling heavy across his shoulders. Beside the door sat a row of boots, one pair for work, another for the yard, and the third, the pair he laced now, black, worn but solid, boots that had traveled with him through more than one country where names were never written down. He tied them quickly, double-knotted, every movement precise. In the garage, the faint smell of oil hung in the air. His truck sat waiting, a reliable old Chevy with mud still dried along the wheel wells. He climbed in, slid the key into the ignition, and turned it without pause. The engine rumbled awake, low and steady. The sound filled the narrow space, then spilled out into the quiet neighborhood when he rolled down the driveway. The town around him slept, porches dim, curtains drawn, dogs curled on steps. Daniel's headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across houses that had no idea of the storm unfolding just down the road. To anyone looking out their window, he was just a father driving through the night, maybe on an errand, maybe restless. They would never guess the weight behind his still hands on the wheel, or the way his eyes flicked to every cross street and shadow. The road to the diner stretched out ahead, a familiar path he had traveled countless times. Each signpost and curve felt sharper tonight, his focus narrowing, his body tuned, as if he were back on a mission. The hum of the tires against the asphalt was steady, the kind of sound that could lull another driver into ease. For Daniel, it was only another rhythm to measure, another piece of the world to register and store away. He didn't allow himself to think about what exactly waited for him at Fern's. The details weren't important yet. What mattered was that his daughter had called, and she hadn't spoken. That silence was the clearest message he could have received. Something was happening, something she couldn't handle alone, and she had trusted him with the unspoken truth. That was enough. As he drove, the mask on his face never shifted. The neighbors who thought him a quiet man would never have recognized him in this moment. His body had remembered something they had never seen, something he had kept buried in the stillness of a small life. The soldier was awake again, not by choice, but by necessity. And every mile between him and the diner was another second shaved off the time his daughter had to endure whatever held her in its grip. The radio on the far wall crackled faintly, the old kind that only picked up the county frequency when the static cleared enough to let a voice slip through. It had been silent most of the evening, a detail no one in the diner paid much attention to at first. But as the bikers' laughter swelled and their boots scraped against the floor, the silence from the law grew heavier, almost as though the building itself could sense how far away help really was. Fern's Crossroads diner sat at the edge of 3 counties, a place that didn't quite belong to any one of them. The sheriff's department responsible for its patch of road was tucked nearly 2 towns over, a small brick office with 1 dispatcher and 2 deputies on rotation. On nights like this, with calls already pulling men toward bar fights on the main strip or accidents out on the highway, the diner might as well have been left in the dark. It wasn't neglect. It was distance. A 20-minute drive could feel like an eternity, and everyone inside knew it, even if no one spoke it aloud. Sam leaned heavier on the counter in the kitchen, listening for the faint hum of sirens that never came. His mind toyed with the idea of reaching for the phone, but he knew the truth. The bikers out front would hear him, and even if he managed to call, the voice on the other end would only say the same words he had heard before. Hold tight. We'll get there as soon as we can. As soon as they would never be soon enough. At one booth, an older farmer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the door as though expecting a uniform to walk through it. He kept his hand near his cap, fingers twisting the brim, but his eyes dimmed the longer he stared at that door. He had lived here long enough to know that law in this county came late, if it came at all. A trucker near the corner shook his head faintly, muttering something into his coffee about how the sheriff's deputies weren't likely to waste their night on some noise in a diner. His voice didn't rise above a whisper, but the hopelessness in it rippled through the other men. The bikers seemed to sense it, too. They laughed louder, more freely, the sound of men who knew there was no badge near enough to interfere. They spread out wider, taking booze they hadn't paid for, banging fists against tables and mock toasts, clinking their knives against mugs like they owned the place. Their confidence came not just from numbers or size, but from the certainty that they ruled the ground they stood on, at least until someone stronger arrived. Hannah continued her quiet rounds, her hands moving steadily as though the weight of that truth didn't press against her chest. She knew the sheriff's office was too far. She knew the men in the diner wouldn't rise, no matter how much their pride told them they should. All she had was her silence and the call she had already made. It wasn't the law she had reached for. It was her father. Outside, the night stretched quiet beyond the neon flicker of the diner sign. The road ran empty in both directions, no headlights cutting through the dark, no sign of sirens painting the horizon. The isolation was complete. Inside, every man at the counter felt it, and every biker fed off it. The sheriff wasn't coming, not tonight, not in time. The diner was alone. The diner was thick with noise, but beneath the laughter of the bikers ran another sound entirely, a silence that clung to the farmers, truckers, and mechanics who sat scattered across the booths. It was a silence of men who knew they should act but didn't, who felt the burn of shame rise in their throats, yet swallowed it down with lukewarm coffee. Their eyes flicked from one another to counter, where Hannah moved with steady hands, then back to the tabletop in front of them. No one wanted to meet another man's gaze for too long. Eye contact would mean acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would mean admitting what they weren't doing. One farmer, his cap pulled low, shifted in his seat. His calloused hands that could lift hay bales and mend barbed wire, rested uselessly around his mug. He glanced toward the trucker in the corner, a broad man with a grease-stained jacket and a thick beard. Their eyes met for a heartbeat, and in that look was a question they were both too afraid to voice. Should we do something? The trucker lowered his eyes, pretending to study the dark swirl at the bottom of his cup. The farmer sighed and pressed his lips together, his shame tightening into silence. At another booth sat a pair of mechanics from the shop down on Main. They were younger. Their faces still lined the kind of defiance that came from men who thought they could handle trouble. But even they hadn't moved. One toyed with the ketchup bottle on the table, spinning it between his fingers, while the other tapped his boot against the floor, restless but rooted. Every time one of the bikers shifted or barked out a laugh, their courage shrank a little more, pressed back down by the weight of the numbers against them. Sam, watching from the pass-through, could see it all unfolding. He had worked here long enough to know the men in this town weren't cowards. They were the kind who got up before dawn, who worked until their backs ached, who carried their families on shoulders already bent with age. But he also knew they weren't fighters. Not against men like these. They were practical, steady folk who measured risk like they measure rainfall, calculating whether it would nourish or destroy. And tonight, the calculation was simple. Standing up meant pain, maybe worse, so they stayed seated. The bikers felt that hesitation in the air and fed on it. Their laughter grew looser, their voices louder. One slammed his palm against the counter just to see the regulars jump, and when they did, the roar that followed shook the walls. Another tilted his head back and drained a mug of beer, then tossed it against the booth wall, letting it shatter into pieces. No one challenged him. No one even sighed. The broken glass glittered under the neon lights, a reminder of what it would cost to resist. Hannah moved among it all with her quiet steadiness, collecting empty plates, wiping spills, her eyes never rising above the task in front of her. The regulars watched her, each man silently hoping she wouldn't break, each man hating himself a little for not stepping in. Shame pressed down on them heavier than the fear, but the fear still won. Every man in the diner weighed his options in those long minutes. They thought of their wives at home, their children asleep, the barns that needed tending, the rigs that needed hauling. They thought of how easily men like these bikers could turn their lives upside down. And so they stayed seated, their inaction binding them tighter than courage ever could. And through it all, the only person who moved forward was Hannah. The booth in the far corner had always been quietest place in the diner, the one where couples sat in the evenings or where travelers slid into the padded seat to rest before getting back on the road. Tonight it had been claimed by 3 of the bikers, their jackets tossed carelessly across the seat backs, their boots stretched across the vinyl bench opposite them. Plates sat cold on the table, the food barely touched, but the empty mugs lined up along the edge told the story clearly enough. They weren't here for supper. They were here to take up space, to stretch themselves across the room until everyone else felt pushed to the edges. Hannah passed by with a tray balanced against her hip, her pace measured, her eyes steady on the table she was clearing. One of the men in the back booth leaned forward, his grin wide and slow. His knuckles tapped against the tabletop, drawing the attention of the others. And then his voice carried across the room. "Hey, sweetheart, how about you come sit with us a while?" His tone wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the hum of the room. Every head lifted slightly, every set of shoulders tensed. The man's grin deepened when Hannah didn't respond. He leaned back into the booth, spreading his arms across the top of the seat like he owned it, his eyes never leaving her. "Don't play shy. There's room right here." He slapped the seat beside him, the sound loud, echoing through the sudden stillness. The other bikers laughed, some pounding fists on the table, some whistling. The noise wasn't cheerful. It was jagged, mocking, meant to unsettle the entire diner. Hannah paused only for a second, her tray balanced against her arm. Then she set it down on the counter and picked up a rag. She didn't acknowledge the invitation, didn't look toward the back booth. Instead, she turned to the nearest table and began wiping the surface with her steady rhythm, as though she hadn't heard the demand at all. Her silence was her answer, but the refusal only sharpened the mood. The air in the diner grew colder, though no window had opened and no draft slipped through the walls. The farmers shifted in their seats, their hands tightening around their mugs, but none of them stood. The trucker in the corner let out a slow breath, heavy with frustration, but his eyes stayed fixed on the tabletop. Everyone felt the weight of the moment. They knew the bikers weren't just making a joke now. They were testing the ground, pressing farther, trying to see how much they could claim before someone pushed back. The man in the booth tilted his head, his grin turning thin. "You hear me? Or do I need to come get you myself?" His words carried like a knife, sliding into every corner of the room. The laughter around him swelled again, but it was sharper now, tinged with something darker. The kind of sound that made the walls feel closer, the kind of sound that pressed people deeper into their seats. Sam, still watching from the kitchen window, gripped his spatula so tightly his knuckles whitened. He wanted to storm out, to plant himself between Hannah and the men, but he knew how quickly that would end. One wrong move and the whole room would ignite. He muttered something under his breath and banged a pan harder than necessary on the stove, the clatter a small protest no one heard. Hannah finished wiping the table, set the rag over her shoulder, and picked up her tray again. She turned toward the counter, her expression unreadable, her movement steady. She hadn't given them what they wanted, but she hadn't given them cause to act either. Still, the tension didn't break. It lingered heavy in the air, colder with every breath, as though the whole room had stepped closer to a cliff's edge and no one knew who would fall first. The clock above the service window ticked on, its second hand dragging around the face with sound that felt louder than it had ever been before. Each tick cut through the weight of voices, through the scrape of boots and the slap of palms on tabletops. Every swing of that second hand stretched time thinner, like the night itself was holding its breath. For Hannah, each passing moment was a reminder that help was coming, though she could not yet see it. Her chest rose and fell with quiet steadiness, every breath measured, every blink deliberate. She could not allow herself to break. The bikers sprawled wider in the diner, their laughter uneven now, sharper the edges, as though impatience had joined their game. They had money on the counter and a demand hanging in the air, and they were waiting to see if anyone would force them to back down. When Hannah passed, their eyes followed her, their comments sliding low and crude across the booths. They wanted reaction, any reaction, but she gave them none. Her silence had hardened into something they couldn't read, and that unsettled them in ways their laughter tried to cover. The regulars noticed too. Farmers sat hunched, their mugs long drained, afraid to stand, ashamed to stay seated. One traced the rim of his cup with a finger, his knuckle trembling with the effort to appear calm. The trucker in the corner stared at the door, as if willing someone in uniform to walk through it, but the door stayed closed. A mechanic whispered something to his friend, and the friend shook his head, eyes lowered. They were all waiting, the same way Hannah was waiting, but their waiting was laced with fear. Hers was laced with trust. Her father would come. She didn't know how soon, didn't know how far he had been from the phone when she called, but she knew he had heard her silence. That was enough. The thought of him moving toward her now was the anchor that kept her steady, the reason her breast did not shorten, the reason her hands did not shake when she set plates on the counter. The minutes bled together, each one dragging longer than the last. The clock ticked again, and the sound cut across the room like a reminder that time had not stopped, even if it felt like it had. Hannah's eyes flicked to it once, then back to her work, careful not to linger. If she let herself count the minutes, she would lose her calm. Instead, she focused on the rhythm of her movements, the way the tray balanced against her hip, the way her rag folded neatly against her hand, the way her feet carried her from booth to counter and back again. A biker drummed his fingers against the table, impatient now. Another tapped the rim of his mug with a knife, The metallic ring sharp, deliberate. The leader smirked, leaning back with his arms spread, watching Hannah as if she were a clock of her own, waiting for her to run down. The tension in the room pressed heavier with each sound, but Hannah's breathing stayed steady. She had called. She had done her part. All she could do now was wait, each minute stretching into an hour, each breath carrying her one step closer to the moment when the door would open and the balance of the night would change. The headlights cut across the gravel lot in a slow, deliberate sweep, dust rising in a beam before settling back into the night. The sound was nothing like the thunder of motorcycles that had stormed the diner earlier. It was a steady hum of an old pickup, reliable, worn, carrying a presence that didn't need to announce itself with noise. The truck rolled to a stop, the crunch of tires on gravel echoing in the stillness outside. Then the engine quieted, leaving the neon sign's weak flicker as the only movement in the lot. Inside, the bikers hardly noticed at first. Their laughter still rang against the walls, though it had dulled into a restless rhythm, each joke sharper, each shove rougher than the last. But the regulars noticed. The truck's headlights had cut briefly through the windows before disappearing, and for a moment, a different kind of silence touched the room. A farmer lifted his eyes from his mug. The trucker in the corner leaned just slightly forward. Even Sam in the kitchen straightened, his spatula frozen midair. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The driver's door creaked open. A pair of boots stepped onto gravel, slow and even. Daniel Cross didn't slam the door behind him. He closed it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had no interest in drawing attention, yet knew he already had it. The night air carried the faint scent of dust and oil as he crossed the lot, his silhouette moving steady beneath the failing neon. No rush, no swagger, no wasted movement. Just presence. The bell above the door jingled when he stepped inside, the same gentle sound it always made for customers. But tonight it rang louder, sharper, against the backdrop of biker voices. Daniel paused just past the threshold, his eyes scanning the room without hurry. He didn't need long. In one glance, he saw everything. The pile of money on the counter, the bikers spread across the booths, the regulars sunk deep into shame, and his daughter moving between tables with her steady silence. He didn't storm forward or bark demands. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the air. Hannah looked up for the first time that night, her eyes meeting his just long enough to catch what she had been waiting for. Then she lowered them again, slipping back into her rhythm, because the weight was no longer hers to carry. One of the bikers nearest the door gave a short laugh, nudging the man beside him. "Look what wandered in. Old-timer wants a coffee." The others chuckled, their voices mocking, but uncertain. There was something in the way Daniel stood, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders loose but steady, that didn't quite fit the picture they wanted to paint. The scar-faced leader leaned forward on his stool, his smirk widening as he studied the newcomer. "Evening, Pops," he called, loud enough for the room. "Careful where you sit. Booths are full, and so's the counter. Might be standing room only." Laughter followed, jagged and rough, but thinner than before. Daniel didn't answer. He moved to the counter with slow, even steps, his boots quiet against the linoleum. He pulled out a stool and sat, not looking at the leader, not looking at the cash, just setting his hands flat on the counter in front of him. His face was unreadable, calm as stone, but his eyes had already measured every angle, every distance, every man in the room. The diner had been swallowed whole hours earlier, but with one quiet arrival, the ground began to shift. Nothing dramatic, no roar, no rush, just a presence that made the walls feel steadier, the floor surer, the silence heavier. Daniel Cross had arrived. The bell of the diner door jingled as Daniel stepped inside, the small sound lost beneath the scrape of boots and the rough laughter rolling through the booths. But for those who'd been waiting, those whose shame had kept them pressed to their seats, the sound landed like a spark. Heads lifted, eyes flicked toward the entrance, and for the first time all night, something in the room shifted. Daniel paused just inside the door, his boots planted firmly on the linoleum. He took in the room in one sweep, not hurried, not obvious, but deliberate. His eyes moved with the precision of a man trained to read chaos at a glance. He saw the pile of crumpled bills lying untouched on the counter, He saw the bikers sprawled in booths, their leather jackets spread wide, their smirks sharpened by the false courage of numbers. He saw the farmers hunched low, their hands tied around mugs long gone cold, and the trucker in the corner who had stared at the same empty cup for nearly an hour. He saw Sam in the kitchen window, spatula frozen midair, sweat shining faint on his brow. And then he saw her. Hannah stood near the counter, rag folded in her hands, her hair falling loose against her cheek. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't breaking. She was steady, her shoulders straight, her eyes lowered in the same practiced silence she had worn all night. To anyone else, it might have looked like surrender. To Daniel, it was something else entirely. He knew his daughter's silence. He knew the discipline in it, the strength it carried. It was the stillness of someone who had chosen not to bow, even when the weight pressed hardest. Their eyes met for only a second. Enough for her to see that he was here, enough for him to see she had endured. Then she lowered her gaze again, slipping back into her rhythm, leaving the moment in his hands. The bikers noticed his entrance too, though not with the same weight. One near the back elbowed his friend, a crooked grin spreading across his face. Another leaned back against the booth, tossing a leg over the seat like he was settling in for a show. The scar-faced leader turned on his stool, his smirk widening as he studied the newcomer. To them, Daniel was just another old man, another face to sneer at. His silence was mistaken for hesitation, his calm for weakness. They saw a quiet widower walking into a room they already owned. But the regulars knew better, even if they couldn't say it. They had seen Daniel enough in the diner before. Sitting in the corner with Hannah, his voice low, his eyes steady, his presence carrying a kind of gravity that made people speak softer around him. Tonight that presence was sharper, heavier, as if the quiet he carried had solidified into something immovable. The regulars didn't know his past, not the details, but they felt it now. It was in the way his body filled the doorway without effort, in the way his gaze swept the room like he had been counting exits since the moment he arrived. For a long moment, the diner held still. The laughter thinned, the tension thickened, and every breath seemed louder than it should have been. Daniel stood inside the doorway, eyes on his daughter, eyes on the bikers, eyes on the fear etched into the walls. He didn't move quickly. He didn't need to. His first glance was enough to change the air. The scrape of wood against tile cut through the silence like a blade. A chair, dragged back hard from the counter, screeched across the linoleum until it landed with a thud. The sound snapped the laughter into focus, drawing every eye toward a man who had moved it. He was broad across the shoulders, tattoos snaking down both arms, his leather vest marked with the insignia of the gang. His grin spread slow, the kind of grin meant to mock, meant to show teeth without threat. He leaned on the chair with one hand, his other wrapped loosely around a half-empty mug. "Well, look at this," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to command the room. "Grandpa decided to join us for supper." The words hung in the air, heavy with derision, and a few of the other bikers chuckled, their voices sharp and mean. He tipped the mug slightly toward Daniel, letting the coffee inside slosh against the rim. "You want a cup, old man? Might keep you awake past bedtime." The laughter that followed was jagged, eager, but Daniel did not move. He stood by the counter still, his hands resting calmly on the wood. His face was unreadable, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the man who had spoken. He didn't answer, didn't rise to the bait. Silence pressed heavier around him than any words could. The biker shifted, emboldened by what he thought was hesitation. He pulled the chair out farther, scraping it again across the floor, dragging the sound long and deliberate. "Come on, take a seat," he said, jerking his chin toward the stool. "Drink your coffee. Mind your own business. This here's our night." He tapped the mug against the counter, letting the sound ring, his grin widening. "Ain't no reason for you to go getting in the middle of things that don't concern you." The regular sat stiff, watching with shallow breaths. The farmer at the end of the counter lowered his eyes, ashamed of his own stillness. The trucker gripped his spoon until it bent, but he didn't lift his head. Sam in the kitchen muttered a curse under his breath, the words lost under the hum of the grill. Everyone waited to see how Daniel would answer. Daniel didn't speak. He reached forward, slow and measured, and took the chair the biker had offered. He slid it back toward the counter. not with the scrape of bravado, but with the controlled strength of a man who knew every movement was a statement. The legs of the chair tapped once against the floor, steady, final. He sat down, resting his hands flat on the counter once more. His posture was straight, his gaze calm. He didn't need words to answer. The weight of his presence filled the silence the biker had tried to command. The biker's grin faltered just slightly, the edges cracking as uncertainty flickered across his face. He covered it with a chuckle, shaking his head, raising his mug as though toasting the old man's compliance. But the laugh didn't carry the same confidence. It was thinner now, forced. Something in Daniel's stillness had pressed against him. Something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. The room, once noisy, fell into a brittle quiet. The clock ticked above the past window, its sound sharp and slow. Daniel sat in silence, unmoved, his eyes steady. And though no one said aloud, everyone in the diner could feel it. The night had shifted again, and the ground beneath the bikers' laughter was no longer as solid as they believed. Daniel sat with the ease of a man who had nothing to prove. His boots rested square on the linoleum, his hands open and steady against the counter, his back straight but not rigid. He did not hunch like the farmers, did not fidget like the mechanics, did not hide behind a paper like the trucker in the corner. He simply sat, still and quiet, his eyes steady, his breathing even. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, casting a pale glow over his weathered features. But there was no strain in his face, no fear, no rush, just calm. The gang mistook it instantly. To them, an old man at a counter was nothing more than an easy target, another piece of the night to twist into their game. His silence read as surrender. His calm looked like ignorance. They saw someone past his prime, someone who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time, and they laughed because they thought it meant they owned the room even more. "Look at him," one of the bikers muttered, nudging the man beside him. "Doesn't even know where he is. Thinks this is Sunday service." Laughter rolled again, sharp and jagged, spilling across the diner walls. Another slapped the table, his rings clanging against the edge, as if the noise itself could draw Daniel into reacting. But Daniel didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed, not glazed, not lost, fixed. He saw every detail, even if they didn't realize it. He saw the scar-faced leader lean back in his stool, his boots braced wide on the floor. He saw the twitch of a hand drumming fingers against a knife's handle. He saw Hannah's shoulders straight as she wiped down a table, never once letting her pace falter. He saw the fear in the faces of the regulars, shame written in their downcast eyes. He cataloged everything in silence, and with each passing second, his stillness grew heavier. The bikers felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Their laughter rang out, but it landed thinner, forced, bouncing back hollow against the calm that radiated from the counter. They had expected protest or pleading, or at least a word of defiance to sharpen their fun. What they found instead was a man who did not blink when mocked, who did not flinch when noise tried to break him. His silence unsettled them in ways they couldn't admit, though they covered it with louder jeers. Sam leaned out from the kitchen window, his eyes locked on Daniel. He had seen plenty of men come and go through the diner, but none had ever sat like this. There was weight in that stillness, weight that pulled the air tighter, that slowed the laughter, that made even the clock's ticking sound louder. Sam didn't know Daniel's past, not the details, but in that moment he understood enough. This was not an ordinary silence. This was the silence of a man who had carried it through deserts and jungles, who had survived by waiting longer, by outlasting storms that would have broken lesser men. The farmers felt it too. Their shame burned deeper as they realized they were hiding while one man sat alone against the tide. The trucker shifted in his seat, his eyes flicking from the bikers to Daniel, his jaw clenched. None of them spoke, but each of them knew something was building. Daniel's silence filled the diner until it pressed against every wall. The bikers underestimated it, thought it weakness, thought it old age. They didn't yet understand the weight of it, the patience buried inside it, the power waiting behind it. But they would. The air in the diner had stretched so thin that every sound carried sharper than it should have. The hum of the lights above seemed louder, the ticking clock more insistent, the scrape of a fork against a plate like nails against glass. Daniel's silence held steady at the counter, his hands open on the wood, his shoulders loose, his eyes steady. The bikers laughed and shifted, but their voices came thinner now, forced to fill the spaces his calm created. Hannah moved between tables with her same measured rhythm, rag folded in her hand, tray balanced against her hip. She hadn't broken, and that steadiness was a thorn none of the gang could quite ignore. It was the scar-faced leader who decided to push again. His patience was gone. The money on the counter had been ignored. The jokes hadn't landed the way he wanted, and the old man's silence had started to feel like a challenge. He leaned forward on his stool, his eyes narrowing as Hannah passed, and his hand shot out again. Fingers curled around her wrist, tighter this time, pulling her just enough off balance to make the rag drop from her hand. The fabric fell to the floor with a soft thud, small but loud in the brittle silence. Hannah's shoulders stiffened, though her face stayed calm. She didn't yank back, didn't cry out, but the tension in her arm betrayed the pressure of his grip. The laughter erupted once more, louder than before, jagged and mean, bouncing off the tile and chrome. The bikers pounded their fists on the tables, whistling and shouting, feeding off the cruelty of the moment. And that was when Daniel moved. It wasn't sudden, not in the frantic way of men who act from impulse. It was deliberate, precise, the kind of motion that belonged to someone who had waited, measured, and chosen the exact second. His chair slid back on the counter, the scrape of its legs against the floor silencing half the laughter. He rose to his full height, his boots planted firm on the linoleum, his shoulders squared. His face was calm, unreadable, but his eyes had sharpened into steel. The bikers stilled, their noise cutting short as they realized the old man wasn't content to sit anymore. The scar-faced leader still clutched Hannah's wrist, but his smirk faltered when Daniel's shadow stretched across the counter. The room seemed to contract around the moment, the air pulling tighter, heavier. The regulars lifted their eyes, hope flickering where shame had lived. Daniel's voice broke the silence with a single word, steady and low, but carrying more weight than a shout. Enough! The word landed like a blow. It wasn't loud, but it was final. It carried the authority of a man who had said it before in darker places, to men more dangerous than these, and who had always been obeyed. The sound of it settled into the room, stilling the laughter, cooling the air. The scar-faced leader blinked, his grip loosening just slightly around Hannah's wrist. His grin faltered into a sneer, but the confidence behind it had cracked. Around him, the other bikers shifted in their seats, glancing between each other, as if waiting to see who would laugh first, who would challenge the word that had cut through them all. None did. Hannah stepped back, her arms sliding free, the rag still on the floor between them. She didn't look at her father, didn't need to. His presence had already shifted the balance. The laughter was gone, the mockery silenced. The night, once owned by the gang, now waited on the weight of one man's word. The silence after Daniel's word lingered longer than the laughter ever had. It filled every booth, pressed into every corner of the diner, and made the neon buzz seem louder than before. The scar-faced leader let go of Hannah's wrist, more from instinct than choice, as though his body recognized something his pride would not allow. She slipped her hand free without rushing, bending just long enough to retrieve the rag from the floor, and then moved toward the counter with a steady pace. The bikers watched her, their grins faltering, their jeers drying on their tongues. Hannah stepped behind the counter, setting the rag down beside the register, as if it were any other night, as if she were merely following her routine. But her movement carried meaning. The counter was no longer just a space for plates and mugs. It had become a line. She stood on one side of it, and her father, without a word or a gesture, had taken the other. Daniel remained standing, his back straight, his boots planted wide, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't so much as clenched his fists. But he stood between his daughter and the men who had tried to take something that wasn't theirs, and the air itself seemed to acknowledge the change. The laughter was gone, replaced by the sound of shifting boots, the scrape of leather against vinyl, the restless shuffle of men who suddenly felt less certain. The regulars noticed it immediately. The farmers straightened in their seats, their shame no longer pressing as heavily on their shoulders. The trucker in the corner let out a slow, measured breath, his gaze lifting for the first time in what felt like hours. The mechanics leaned forward in their booth, their hands still, their faces sharpened with quiet attention. They all felt the balance turn, as if someone had pulled a chain taut and the slack that had belonged to the gang was gone. The bikers tried to recover, to fill the space with bravado. One of them barked out a laugh, but it came too quick, too thin, and it fell flat in the silence. Another drummed his fingers against the table. The sharp tap, 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 a weak attempt to reclaim rhythm. Even the scar-faced leader, who had been the loudest voice all night, leaned back on a stool with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. His jaw tightened between words he chose not to say. Daniel didn't need to move closer. He didn't need to raise his hand or issue another command. His presence alone was enough to hold the room. He stood as though the floor belonged to him, as though the walls recognized him, as though the diner itself was on his side. Hannah's stillness behind the counter mirrored his. Her eyes lowered, but her breathing calm, her silence no longer mistaken for weakness. Together, father and daughter stood as 2 points of steadiness in a room that thrived on chaos only moments before. The shift was sudden, but it was absolute. The bikers had arrived on the night with noise and mockery. Now they sat in a silence they could not control, a silence commanded by the quiet strength of a man who had spoken just one word. Every second that passed deepened the change, pressing the gang against the weight of something they couldn't laugh away. The room balanced on a knife's edge, and everyone felt it. The bikers shifted uneasily in their seats, leather creaking against vinyl, boots scraping faintly against the tile. For the first time since they had stormed into the diner, their confidence wavered. They weren't sure what had changed exactly, just that something had. The old man's silence carried weight, and weight made men second-guess themselves. The scar-faced leader narrowed his eyes, his grin thin but brittle. He leaned back in his stool, forcing a smirk as if to reclaim control. Yet his fingers drummed against the counter, a rhythm that betrayed nerves he would never admit. He glanced at his men, daring one of them to laugh, to break the heaviness pressing down on them. A biker at the nearest booth barked out a chuckle, too loud, too sharp. "What's the matter, boys?" He's just sitting there. He shoved his elbow into the ribs of the man beside him. "Old-timer wants to play hero. Let him." His laugh rang hollow, bouncing back off the silence instead of filling it. Another shifted forward, planting his elbows on the table. His eyes stayed on Daniel, but there was no humor in them now, only a restless energy searching for direction. "Come on, you all acting scared of some granddad with a truck? Man's probably got a bum knee and a bedtime." His words earned a few chuckles, but thin ones strained. No one roared like before. Hannah watched from behind the counter, her rag folded neatly in her hand. She didn't lift her head, but her eyes flicked once toward her father. His stance hadn't shifted. His hands were still loose at his sides, his boots planted, his gaze steady. He wasn't answering the jeers because he didn't have to. His silence was louder than their noise, and the longer he held it, the more it pressed against him. The regulars saw it too. Farmers leaned forward in their booths, their shame slowly easing into something else, recognition. The trucker's jaw worked, grinding against a truth he couldn't ignore. Even Sam in the kitchen felt it, his hand frozen over the grill, as if he were afraid any sound he made would break the spell. They were watching a shift they couldn't explain, but they knew it was real. One of the younger bikers, eager to prove himself, slapped the table and stood up. His chair toppled backward, clattering against the floor. He jabbed a finger toward Daniel. "You don't tell us what to do, old man. You think you can just walk in here, stand around and stare us down? Nah, we run this place tonight." He puffed out his chest, his voice trying to carry strength it didn't have. The others muttered, half in support, half in unease. Some nodded, egging him on, desperate to cling to bravado slipping through their hands. Others avoided his gaze, sensing that every word spoken against the silence only deepened the danger they didn't yet understand. Daniel didn't move. His eyes locked on the young man, calm as stone, unblinking. He didn't answer, didn't rise to the taunt. But the weight of that gaze carried something the others couldn't name, and it landed heavier than any threat. The young biker faltered mid-step, his jaw tightening as he realized his word hadn't landed. His friends chuckled weakly behind him, but their voices lacked conviction. The brotherhood was cracking, tested by a presence none of them had expected. Half of them still mistook quiet for weakness, trying to laugh it away. The other half felt something colder, something that told them they had already pushed too far. Daniel's silence held steady as the young biker hovered, half a step forward. Fists balled like a boy still trying to prove he belonged among men. The room seemed to shrink around them, but Daniel didn't move to meet him. Instead, his hands shifted with slow precision, drawing every eye in the diner without a sound. He reached for the pile of bills still scattered on the counter, the money the scar-faced leader had tossed down earlier like a dog throwing scraps. The paper was crumpled, greasy from fingers that had meant it as a humiliation, not a payment. Daniel gathered it all with careful movements, each note pressed flat beneath his palm. No rush, no flourish. Just calm, steady order. The bikers quieted without realizing they had. Their laughter strangled mid-breath as they watched. Even the young one, who had stepped forward, hesitated as though the old man's simple act of stacking bills had undone his bravado. Daniel pressed the cash into a neat pile, aligning the edges, his fingers moving with the kind of discipline that came from years of precision. When he was finished, he slid the pile across the counter, not toward himself, but back across the wood, toward the scar-faced leader who had thrown it down. The notes rasped against the surface, the sound thin but cutting through the room like a blade. The leader's smirk faltered. His jaw worked once, a twitch he tried to mask with chuckle, but it came late, brittle, hollow. He hadn't expected the insult to be returned, and certainly not like this. He had wanted Hannah to be bought, her silence to be mocked, the entire diner to laugh at her expense. Instead, the money sat in front of him again, laid bare for what it was, an insult made small. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His stare rested on the leader, calm and unflinching, the kind of look that weighed more than any words could. It was not anger, not even contempt. It was recognition, the kind of stare that measured man and found him wanting. The bikers shifted under it, glancing at their leader, waiting for him to laugh it off, to reclaim the ground that was slipping away beneath them. The scar-faced man lifted his chin, forcing a sneer. He tapped the pile of money with one finger, trying to make the act look casual, but the motion carried no weight. The silence pressed harder against him, every second stretching. He cleared his throat and muttered something low, meant for his men, but it sounded more like excuse than command. Hannah stood behind the counter, her hands folded neatly at her waist, her eyes lowered, but she felt the change ripple through the room. Her father had taken the very weapon they had used against her and turned it into nothing more than paper. The laughter that had once filled the diner seemed distant now, faint echoes against the steady weight of one man's presence. The regulars watched with quiet awe. Farmers leaned forward in their booths, no longer shrinking, their shame giving way to something steadier. The trucker's spoon, bent in his fist, fell back to the table with a dull clink. Sam in the kitchen exhaled hard, his grip loosening on the spatula he hadn't realized he still held tight. The young biker who had stepped forward shifted uneasily, his fists loosening. He glanced back at his brothers, then at the money on the counter, then at the man who hadn't said a word but had already undone their noise. Daniel's hands rested once more on the table, open, steady, unarmed. But the weight of them there, the calm behind his eyes, said more than fists or weapons ever could. It told the room that this night was no longer theirs to command. The scar-faced leader stared at the neat stack of bills resting in front of him, his smirk wavering under the weight of Daniel's silence. The laughter had drained from the room, but he couldn't let it end there. His pride wouldn't allow it. He cleared his throat, shifted on his stool, and forced out a chuckle. The sound was too loud, too sharp, cracking against a heavy quiet that had settled like smoke. It was the wrong kind of laughter, strained, desperate, and everyone in the diner knew it. "Man, you serious?" he barked, shaking his head as if trying to laugh off the unease spreading among his men. He pushed himself up from the stool with a lazy swagger, trying to hide the stiffness in his shoulders. He towered over the counter now, standing inches from Daniel, his grin stretched thin across scarred lips. "You think sliding cash back my way makes you somebody? You don't even know who you're dealing with, old man." The words carried, but they didn't land. The regulars watched from their booths, their eyes wide, their breaths held. They could feel the tension winding tighter with every syllable. The farmers clenched their mugs until their knuckles whitened. The trucker shifted forward, and even Sam in the kitchen froze mid-motion, the spatula hovering above the grill. They all knew what the leader didn't, that Daniel hadn't moved because he hadn't needed to. Daniel remained seated, his back straight, his hands resting calmly on the counter. His eyes didn't waver, didn't flicker to the knife hanging at the leader's hip or the fists hovering close. He just watched, steady, patient, the way a man does when he's already measured every angle and found the ground solid beneath him. The leader mistook the calm for weakness. His laughter came again, jagged and mean, rolling out across the diner with a forced bravado that made his own men chuckle nervously along with him. "Look at this," he said, gesturing to Daniel with one hand, his rings glinting under the dull fluorescent lights. "We got ourselves a hero. Doesn't talk, doesn't move, just stares. What's the plan, huh? You gonna bore us to death with those eyes?" The bikers tried to match his laughter, but the sound was thin, strained. It didn't carry the same weight it had earlier in the night. Some glanced sideways at each other, their grins faltering, their boots shifting restlessly against the floor. They felt it, even if their leader didn't, that the balance had tipped. Daniel still didn't speak. His silence was heavier than words, heavier than fists, heavier than all the noise the gang could muster. He let the laughter echo and die in the corners of the diner, never once looking away. His gaze stayed locked on the leader, calm, steady, unflinching. It was not the stare of an old man being mocked. It was the stare of a soldier who had seen worse, who had walked into storms darker than this and walked out standing. Hannah stood behind the counter, her breast steady, her eyes lowered but her presence rooted. She didn't flinch when the leader's voice rose, didn't shrink when his laughter rang false. She knew the stillness across from him wasn't weakness. It was readiness. The leader leaned closer across the counter now, his grin tight, his voice low enough for only Daniel and the closest men to hear. "You got no idea who I am," he muttered, his laugh breaking into a sneer. But Daniel did not move. His silence was its own weapon, and the longer it held, the clearer it became to everyone else in the room. The wrong man was laughing, and he didn't yet know how close he stood to the edge. The laughter hung brittle in the air, cracking like thin ice beneath too much weight. The leader leaned forward, trying to stretch his smirk wider, but it was one of his men, taller, younger, eager to prove himself, who finally broke the tension. His chair screeched back against the floor, the sound jagged enough to snap every gaze in the diner toward him. With a growl deep in his throat, he lunged forward, his boots pounding across the linoleum, his hand reaching for Daniel's shoulder, as if dragging the quiet old man down would restore the balance the gang had lost. But Daniel had been waiting. There was no pause, no visible transition from stillness to movement. 1 second he was seated, hands open on the counter, eyes steady. The next his body coiled and snapped into action with a precision that defied age. His chair tipped back, legs scraping just enough to mark the shift, and his arm shot upward. The biker's wrist was caught mid-grab, twisted sharply before the man's fingers could even brush cloth. A gasp tore from his throat as his knees buckled under the sudden torque. Daniel rose in the same motion, his boots planting firm, his other hand sliding to the back of the man's neck. With one fluid step, he redirected the biker's momentum, slammed him chest first against the counter, and drove him down with such control, it looked less like a fight and more like inevitability. The crash of flesh against it echoed across the diner, rattling plates and silverware, snapping mugs against saucers. The biker groaned, his cheek pressed flat to the counter, his arm wrenched high at an angle no body could resist. His free hand flailed for purchase, fingers clawing at the smooth surface, but Daniel's grip held him pinned with unyielding strength. It had taken less than a heartbeat. The young man who had lunged in arrogance was already bent, broken in posture, his body trembling under a force he had underestimated. The regulars gasped, the sound collective and sharp, their shame forgotten, their fear rewritten into something closer to awe. Farmers who had spent the night, lowering their eyes, now leaned forward, mouths parted. The trucker let out a low whistle, quiet but heavy with disbelief. Even Sam in the kitchen froze, spatula raised in midair, his lips parting around words he couldn't quite find. The bikers sat stunned. Their bravado had been torn out from under them in an instant. The leader's grin flickered, his eyes narrowing as he watched one of his own slam down without effort. A few of the men pushed half out of their seats, but none stepped closer. The speed of it unsettled them. They hadn't even seen the move, only the aftermath. Their brother flattened and gasping, his arm twisted like a branch caught in a storm. Daniel didn't shout, didn't gloat. His face was calm, his breathing steady, his stance rooted. He kept the biker pinned without strain, his eyes lifting from the man at the counter to the others watching. The message was clear in his stillness. This was no accident, no lucky move. This was training, discipline, war carried into a quiet diner without fanfare. Hannah, behind the counter, stood with her rag still folded in her hand. Her shoulders were straight, her gaze lowered, but the faintest flicker of breath left her lips, a release she had held all night. Her father had arrived, and with his first strike, the night had changed irrevocably. The diner erupted in an instant. The crash of the first biker's body against the counter had been the spark, and now the fire spread. Chairs scraped back violently, their legs shrieking across the floor before toppling over. Cups shattered as they hit tile, coffee spilling in dark arcs across the linoleum. Plates rattled, silverware clattered to the floor, and the neon hum the sign outside seemed drowned beneath the sudden roar of chaos. The farmers ducked low into their booths, pulling their caps down, their arms thrown protectively over their heads. The trucker slid from his seat to the floor, his wide shoulders hunched as glass rained around him. Sam ducked behind a past window, though his eyes stayed fixed on the scene unfolding. Spatula still gripped tight in his hand, as though it could serve as a weapon. Fear rippled through the regulars, but arose close behind it, because even as the room exploded, Daniel did not falter. The first biker was still pinned against the counter, his arm twisted high, his groans loud beneath the din. Another lunged at Daniel from the side, his fist cocked, rings glinting under the harsh lights. Daniel released the pinned man in a single fluid motion, turning his body into a shield. The incoming punch landed not on Daniel, but on the biker he had just released, the crack of knuckles against jaw followed by a choked curse. Before either could recover, Daniel pivoted, driving his elbow back into the gut of the attacker, folding him over with a wheeze. A third came from behind, swinging a chair like a weapon. The regulars gasped, some shouting warnings, but Daniel had already sensed it. He stepped sideways, the chair smashing against the counter where he had been. In the same breath, he caught the wooden frame mid-swing, twisting from the biker's hands and hurling it across the floor. It skidded into a booth, splintering, sending shards skittering across the tile. Another man lunged low, aiming to tackle him at the waist, but Daniel met him with a knee that sent the biker sprawling back, gasping for air. His boots slid against spilled coffee as he collapsed, clutching his ribs. The scar-faced leader barked orders, his voice harsh, but his words were swallowed by the chaos. His men surged forward in bursts, but they did not move as one. They were a storm, loud and messy, and Daniel was the eye at its center. He moved with precision that cut through noise, every strike measured, every deflection exact. He didn't waste a motion. He didn't chase. He dismantled. A fist came from the left. He caught it, twisted, and sent its owner crashing into a table. A boot came from the right. He sidestepped, grabbed the leg, and flipped the biker onto his back with a thud that shook the floor. A knife flashed in the corner, a short blade pulled from a boot. Daniel stepped inside the arc of the slash, grabbed the man's wrist, and slammed it against the counter until the knife clattered free. Cups shattered under boots. Chairs overturned, the air thick with the scent of coffee, sweat, and fear. But through it all, Daniel remained calm. His face betrayed no anger, no panic. Only the cold focus of a man who had been here before, in darker places, against deadlier odds. Hannah stood behind the counter, her rag clenched in her fist, her breath steady even as the world around her shattered. She watched her father carve through chaos with the same patience he had shown in silence. He was not frantic. He was not wild. He was precise, surgical, dismantling each threat until the din of violence was matched by the groans of men sprawled across the floor. The regulars, ducking in their booths, lifted their eyes just enough to see the truth take shape. The bikers had walked into a fight they had never owned. And Daniel Cross, the quiet widower they had all underestimated, was not a man who lost control. He was a man who ended it. The diner floor was already littered with splintered chairs and broken mugs when another biker rose from the mess, a length of chain coiled in his hand. His face was red with fury, veins standing out in his neck as he swung it once through the air, the heavy metal links rattling like a warning bell. The sound cut through the groans of his fallen brothers, through the hiss of the kitchen grill, through the nervous breaths of the farmers hunched low in their booths. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew the weapon had changed the air. He stepped forward, boots crunching on glass, the chain whipping against the edge of a table with a sharp crack. The regulars flinched at the sound, some ducking lower, others peering out with wide eyes. The scar-faced leader smirked from his stool, nodding toward Daniel, as though the chain would be the answer to what none of the others had managed to accomplish. Daniel stood steady, his boots planted, his chest rising and falling with calm rhythm. He didn't move when the biker spun the chain overhead, the links cutting a sharp whistle through the air. The man snarled, spittle flying as he brought it down in a vicious arc aimed at Daniel's head. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. But Daniel was already moving. His body shifted with the fluid precision of a man trained to read attacks before they landed. He stepped inside the arc, faster than the eye could follow, his left hand snapping up to catch the chain near its handle. His right hand struck forward, catching the biker's wrist mid-swing. With a twist and a pull, the momentum shifted violently. The chain ripped free, tearing from the man's grip, and clattered against the floor with a metallic crash that echoed across the diner like thunder. The biker staggered, his arm wrenched, his balance gone. Daniel didn't waste a motion. He stepped forward, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him sprawling backward onto an overturned chair. The impact rattled the floor, silverware bouncing, mugs rolling off tables to shatter on the tile. The man gasped, wind driven from his lungs, clutching at his ribs as he coughed. The chain lay between them, useless now, its cold steel sprawling across the linoleum. The sound of it hitting the floor lingered in the air, louder in memory than in fact. It was a kind of sound that told everyone watching that something had broken, not just a weapon, but the illusion of strength the gang had carried with them. The regulars lifted their heads, their shame now washed over by awe. A farmer near the window whispered something under his breath. The words drowned in the heavy silence that followed. The trucker shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on Daniel like he was seeing him for the first time. Sam, peering from the kitchen, exhaled hard, his grip finally easing on the spatula he had held like a lifeline. The scar-faced leader's grin twitched, faltering at the edges. His men, sprawled and groaning, glanced at the chain, then at the man who had been disarmed so easily. None moved to retrieve it. The sound of it clattering still rang too loud in their ears. Daniel stood over the fallen weapon, calm as stone. He didn't pick it up, didn't brandish it. He simply let it lie where it had fallen, useless, irrelevant. His hands hung loose at his sides, his eyes sweeping once across the room. He hadn't needed the chain, and everyone knew it. The biker on the floor rolled onto his side, groaning, his bravado gone. The others shifted uneasily, their boots scuffing the glass-strewn floor, but none lunged. They had all seen it. A single move, faster than sight, had undone one of their loudest threats. The diner settled into a new silence, heavier than the one before. The laughter, the jeers, the noise, they were gone. What filled the air now was the clatter of a broken chain, echoing long after it had fallen, and the realization that they were not the predators here. The scar-faced leader had watched long enough. His men lay scattered across the diner floor, some clutching their ribs, others groaning through split lips, their bravado stripped clean by the precision of Daniel's hands. The chain lay coiled and useless on the tiles, its echo still heavy in the room. Broken chairs leaned against booths, mugs and plates lay shattered in coffee-stained puddles, and the air smelled of sweat, grease, and fear. But the leader could not let the night end like this. His pride burned hotter than the ache in his men. He pushed off the counter, standing tall, his boots grinding glass underfoot. His grin was wide, but the edges twitched with something brittle. He cracked his knuckles slowly, loud enough to fill the silence, then spat on the floor between him and Daniel. "You think you've proved something, old man?" he sneered, his voice raw, trying to muster confidence he no longer felt. He stepped forward, his leather vest swinging with emotion, his fists clenched tight. These boys might have gone down easy, but I ain't them. You don't scare me. The regulars tensed, their eyes locked on the moment. Farmers leaned forward in their booths, their breaths caught. The trucker gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles white. Sam leaned out from the kitchen window, grease on his apron, spatula still in hand, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. They all knew what was coming, but none could look away. Daniel stood calm, boots planted, shoulders square. His chest rose once, steady, and his eyes met the leader's without a flicker. He didn't raise his fists, didn't posture, didn't bark words in return. He simply waited, and that waiting pressed harder on the leader than any threat could have. The scar-faced man roared, more to ignite himself in the strike fear, and charged. His fists swung wide, raw power and anger driving them, but no control. Daniel moved with the same precision he had shown all night. He slipped past the first punch, his hand snapping to the leader's wrist, twisting it just enough to force a stumble. The second fist came wild, and Daniel stepped in, his shoulder ramming into the man's chest. The leader staggered back, cursing, and swung again, but Daniel was already inside the arc. His elbow drove into the man's gut, folding him with a grunt. A knee followed, snapping upward, and the air left the leader's lungs in a strangled gasp. His hands clawed at the counter for balance, but Daniel caught his collar and yanked hard, sending him sprawling across the floor. The crash echoed through the diner, louder than any laugh the bikers had roared earlier. The scar-faced leader hit the ground flat, his body twisting as he tried to rise, but Daniel was already above him. With one step forward, his boot pressed firm against the man's chest, pinning him where he lay. The leader froze, his hands gripping Daniel's ankle, but the strength was gone from his grip. His chest heaved beneath the weight, his breath ragged, his pride shattered. His men lay silent around him, their groans the only sound left. The room held still, the tension broken, replaced by something heavier. Finality. The farmers no longer ducked. The trucker exhaled, long and low. Sam set the spatula down on the counter with a clatter, his shoulders sagging with relief. Hannah stood behind the counter, her rag still folded in her hand, her face calm, her eyes lowered. Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His boot pressed steady on the leader's chest said everything. The night was over. The fight was finished. The gang that had walked in with laughter and arrogance now lay scattered, and their leader had fallen beneath the quiet strength of a man who had carried war in silence all along. The diner was hushed except for the groans of the bikers scattered across the floor and the steady hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Shattered glass crunched whenever one of them shifted, and the faint sizzle of the grill in the kitchen reminded everyone that life outside this moment had not stopped. Daniel stood in the center of it all, his boot pressed firm against the scar-faced leader's chest, his stance calm and steady. Hannah was behind the counter, her rag still folded neatly in her hands, her breathing even. The regulars sat frozen in their booths, some upright now, others leaning forward, as if afraid that the silence might break again without warning. Then it came. The faint sound at first, a rising wail carried through the night. The distant cry of sirens, high and sharp, broke the fragile quiet. Every head turned toward the windows, the regulars' eyes widening, relief rushing through them like a tide. The bikers, sprawled and broken, stiffened at the sound, knowing what it meant. The leader beneath Daniel's boot swallowed hard, his bravado finally stripped clean. The wail grew louder, closer, until red and blue light cut across the diner's windows in broken patterns, painting the booze, the counter, and the floor with shifting color. The regulars blinked against the glow, their fear easing as the reality sank in. Help had come at last, though late enough that it was no longer needed. The timing only sharpened the truth. The danger had been answered long before the law arrived. Tires crunched in the gravel outside, engines rumbling low as vehicles rolled to a stop. The sirens cut suddenly, leaving only the hum of idling engines. Doors slammed, heavy boots struck gravel, and muffled voices carried as deputies moved toward the diner. The neon sign buzzed overhead, its tired glow now drowned by the strobes that painted the walls. Inside, Daniel didn't move his boot from the leader's chest. His eyes flicked once toward the window, watching the colors shift, then back to the man beneath him. Calm as ever, he held his ground. Hannah stood straight behind the counter, her eyes still lowered, though the faintest trace of relief softened her face. The farmers exhaled in unison, their shame now buried beneath gratitude. The trucker leaned back against the booth, running a hand over his beard, shaking his head as if he'd just woken from a dream. Sam muttered something under his breath and reached the switch off the grill, the sudden quiet of the kitchen matching the quiet of the floor. The door swung open, the bell jingling weakly above it, and the first deputy stepped inside, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. He froze at the sight. The bikers sprawled across the floor, chairs overturned, broken glass glittering under red and blue flashes. His eyes landed on Daniel, who stood steady with one boot pressed against the chest of the leader, holding him still without effort. The deputy blinked, his mouth half open, as if trying to form a question he couldn't yet find the words for. Behind him, more boots entered, more eyes widening as they took in the scene. The law had arrived, but it was clear to all that the night had already been settled. Outside, the strobes painted the gravel lot in red and blue, colors dancing against the chrome of motorcycles that no longer roared. Inside, silence hung heavy, broken only by the shift of deputies moving carefully into the room, their radios crackling faintly. And through it all, Daniel remained still, calm, his presence commanding even as the weight of authority entered the room. The flashing colors from outside washed across the diner windows, tinting the broken glass on the floor in alternating shades of red and blue. Deputies moved cautiously among the overturned chairs and groaning men, their voices clipped and professional, their hands firm on their belts. Yet the room's true stillness did not belong to them. It belonged to the man at the center, Daniel Cross, his boots steady against the scar-faced leader's chest. And when his eyes lifted, they didn't linger on the deputies or the bikers. They went straight to his daughter. Hannah stood behind the counter, her rag still folded in her hand, though she had long stopped pretending to wipe tables. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, her apron smudged from the night's long work, but her back was straight, her breathing calm. The light caught her face in flashes, red, blue, revealing not a girl broken by fear, but a woman who had endured. For hours she had stood in silence, absorbing jeers, threats, and mocking laughter. Yet she had not bowed, not given them the satisfaction of her despair. Now, under the harsh glow of law enforcement and the softer gravity of her father's presence, she stood as tall as he had known she would. Their eyes met across the counter. Daniel's stare, steady as stone, softened just slightly, a flicker only she would recognize. He saw her strength in that moment, the same strength her mother once carried, the same fire he had carried across deserts and jungles. She had not needed to fight with fists to prove herself. She had fought with endurance, with silence, with a refusal to give her tormentors the power they craved. Hannah's lips pressed together, her chin lifting almost imperceptibly. She didn't smile. This was not a night for smiles, but there was pride in her stillness, a reflection of his own. She had endured until he came, and now, together, they stood as a bond stronger than the fear that filled the diner. The regulars watched quietly. Farmers who had sunk low in shame earlier now lifted their eyes, their gazes moving between father and daughter. The trucker rubbed a hand across his beard, shaking his head at the sight. Sam leaned against the kitchen pass, his apron stained, his arms crossed, a heavy sigh leaving his chest. They all felt it, the weight of something greater than a single night's violence. It was resilience, carried not only by a soldier's discipline, but by a daughter's courage. One of the deputies stepped closer, his voice low, asking if Daniel needed relief, if he would step back and let them take over. Daniel did not answer at first. He looked at Hannah, and she looked back, her silence giving the answer he needed. Then, slow and steady, he removed his boot from the leader's chest and stepped back, his eyes never leaving his daughter's. The deputies rushed in to bind the man, their voices firm and clipped, but the room's attention stayed on the quiet exchange between father and daughter. The neon outside buzzed faintly. The red and blue washed the booths, the counters, the faces of everyone inside. Hannah stood in the glow, her shoulders straight, her father's presence beside her. She was not broken. She was not small. She was a daughter of a man who had carried war in silence, and in her own way, she carried both too. Their bond was unshaken, rooted deep in the fear that had tried to break them. Morning came quietly, the way it always did in the county. Sunlight broke over ridges, spilling gold across fields still damp with dew. Barn doors creaked open, trucks rumbled to life, and roosters called out against the stillness. But beneath the ordinary rhythm, something new threaded through the air. Whispers. They traveled faster than the morning breeze, carried from porch to porch, from store to store, from one set of tired hands to another. At the diner, the neon still flickered weakly, but the mess inside had been cleared. Deputies had carted away the gang, their motorcycles loaded onto flatbeds, their laughter silenced. The broken mugs had been swept, the overturned chairs righted, the counters wiped clean. Hannah moved through it all with her steady rhythm, pouring coffee for farmers who spoke softer than usual, their eyes sliding toward her with respect they had not shown before. Sam flipped eggs on the grill, muttering less, listening more. The air inside Fern's Crossroads diner felt different, heavier with memory, lighter with relief. Out on Main Street, the story had already spread. Some said it began with the scar-faced leader tossing money on the counter. Others swore it started when Hannah lowered her eyes and refused to yield. By dawn, the details shifted with every telling, but one truth held steady. The Cross family had stood against the storm. Farmers who had shrunk in shame now repeated the tale with a new kind of pride, as though bearing witness to Daniel's silence had steadied something in them too. The trucker told his version of the gas station, his voice low but insistent, describing how the old man had moved faster than sight, how one word, asterisk enough asterisk, had quieted a room filled with violence. By noon, every porch sitter, every shopkeeper, every passerby knew the name Cross. Not just Daniel, the quiet widower whose past had been hidden behind calm eyes, but Hannah too. Her silence, her endurance, her refusal to be broken became part of the story. People spoke her name in the same breath as her father's, their bond woven into the telling. Respect grew not out of pity but out of recognition. The gang, once so loud on the county roads, was gone. Their roar no longer shook the windows at night. Their laughter no longer spilled crude and cruel into the diners and bars. Some said they had been run out, others that they had fled after their pride was shattered on linoleum. However it happened, their absence was felt as strongly as their presence had been. Roads that once carried unease now felt open again, free of the echo of engines that had made families lock their doors early. In the weeks that followed, the story settled into legend. Men at the barbershop leaned close, recounting the sound of a chain clattering uselessly to the floor. Women at the market whispered about Hannah's calm, how she had stood behind the counter, rag in hand, until her father arrived. The children listened wide-eyed, hearing about the night when silence proved stronger than laughter, when one family carried more weight than a gang of men. And through it all, the Cross family carried on much as before. Daniel rose with the sun, worked with his hands, and spoke little. Hannah poured coffee and wiped down counters, her quiet presence steady as always. But now when their names were spoken, they carried something heavier. Not just survival, not just endurance. Respect. The town remembered, and in their remembering, the roads grew quieter, the nights safer, and the silence of one family lingered longer than the roar of any gang.